2006, USA, state of Oregon. A small, quiet town where people have known each other their entire lives. Life here usually proceeds slowly and leisurely, but the tranquility of this place can be deceptive. 11th of April, Monday, a gloomy spring day with cool wind and drizzling rain. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 9-year-old Emily Parker got off the school bus at her usual stop, 2 blocks from her home. An ordinary route, an ordinary day, like hundreds of others before. But Emily never arrived home. When the Parker family called the police in the evening, their concern was initially received with restraint. A small delay, childish pranks, nothing unusual. But after a few hours, after the first questioning of neighbors and classmates, it became obvious. The situation was far more serious. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, the first search operations began in the small town. Police cars illuminated the streets with their headlights. Short, sharp commands from law enforcement officers alternated with the anxious silence of residents. It seemed as if every inhabitant took what happened too personally. The police quickly organized groups of volunteers and divided the town into squares for searching, but Emily could not be found on the streets, nor in the yards, nor in the nearby parks. At midnight, the soaked and exhausted volunteers returned empty-handed. During the night, the police took statements from the Parker family. The parents had noticed nothing unusual about Emily's behavior, nor were there any conflicts or problems with peers. An ordinary day, an ordinary family, ordinary circumstances, nothing that could have shed light on what happened. The only clue the investigators immediately obtained was a children's hair clip with pink flowers that was found at the roadside, a few dozen meters from the bus stop. The mother confirmed that the clip indeed belonged to Emily, but it was weak evidence that revealed almost nothing about what might have happened next. By morning, the news of Emily Parker's disappearance had spread throughout the entire town. Residents gathered in groups, made assumptions, and tried to hide their own fear. In this quiet town, such a thing seemed impossible, and precisely because of that, particularly frightening. Questioning of neighbors and witnesses provided first scattered details. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Lewis, remembered a white delivery van that moved slowly down the street on the day of Emily's disappearance. According to the woman, the driver stopped several times and watched attentively the students who were returning from school. No one had remembered the license plate, the make or special characteristics of the vehicle, except for the color and its slow driving manner. This sparse information was enough for the police to carefully check every white delivery van in the area over the following days, questioning the owners and drivers, but this brought no new traces. The driver of the mysterious delivery van remained unknown. Toward the end of the week, the investigators had a first suspect. Ryan Stevenson, a 17-year-old youth who lived in the neighboring house of the Parker family. Ryan did not enjoy a good reputation among the residents. He had repeatedly attracted attention for minor violations, was withdrawn, irritable, got along poorly with peers and adults. He had no convincing alibi for the time of Emily's disappearance. When the police officers visited him at home for the first time, Ryan was visibly nervous, got tangled up in his own words, and seemed very frightened. This immediately attracted the investigators' attention. And although the youth continued to insist he had nothing to do with the matter, the investigators examined his environment, his friends, his home, and his personal belongings closely. But here too, to the disappointment of the detectives, nothing concrete could be found. Meanwhile, one of the teachers at the local school, James Harris, proved to be a particularly active participant in the search. He volunteered as one of the first, helped organize groups, and spoke at town meetings. Some residents noticed that Harris's behavior seemed overly emotional, a little exaggerated, and even intrusive, as if he were more interested in the search than others. At this point, it did not occur to anyone that something else might be hidden behind this eagerness. A few days after Emily Parker's disappearance, the investigations, since no new evidence or witnesses were found, reached a first dead end. The tension in the town grew. Emily's parents found no rest from despair. Then, a week after the beginning of the search, an anonymous call came in to the police hotline. An unknown male voice claimed to have seen Emily walking along a forest path to an abandoned hunting cabin about 40 kilometers from the town. A task force immediately drove to the specified area. When they arrived at the location late in the evening, They discovered barely visible children's tracks that were clearly recognizable on the moist ground. The tracks suddenly broke off at a small creek that ran nearby. Inside the abandoned house, no signs of human presence were found. The found tracks again gave hope for a positive outcome of the search. In the morning, a large-scale operation to comb through the area around the forest house was organized. The police brought in dog handlers and search teams of volunteers. But no one could suspect that these tracks would only lead to another dead end, and more questions than answers. On the evening of the next day, after unsuccessful attempts to find the continuation of the tracks or additional clues, the police chief gave a brief and dry statement to the press. The search continues. At the moment, we have no precise answers, but we will do everything possible. At that time, none of those present could even imagine that the solution to this story would only emerge after long 17 years and would be far more gruesome than one could have imagined on that April evening of the year 2006. In the following weeks, search activity gradually decreased. Not because hope had been lost, but because there were simply no more places that could have been checked again. The people who just recently had gone out daily in volunteer groups gradually returned to their normal activities. The local press wrote less and less frequently about the Emily case and turned to everyday urban events and incidents, which finally plunged the story into a feeling of disturbing uncertainty. Despite the outward calm, the police continued their work. The investigators examined the smallest details and tried to find some new information that could lead the case out of the dead end. Crime scene technicians who examined the place where Emily's tracks broke off in the forest noticed the strange character of her disappearance. They said it gave the impression as if the person who had left these tracks had simply dissolved into thin air. However, experts adhered to more practical versions. Perhaps someone had carried Emily across the creek, or the tracks had been intentionally erased. At the beginning of May, the police received the results of the investigations from the place of disappearance. The only evidence, the hair clip that was found at the roadside near the bus stop, showed no foreign fingerprints, except those of Emily herself. This considerably complicated the police's work because it meant only one thing: the perpetrator, or a random witness, was careful and acted prudently. Meanwhile, the detectives decided to check once more the version with the white delivery van that the elderly neighbor Mrs. Lewis had mentioned. They conducted an additional questioning of residents of the surrounding neighborhoods. In the course of this renewed questioning, another interesting detail emerged. One of the residents, a young woman named Sarah Miller, claimed to have noticed a similar white delivery van near the grocery store about a week before Emily's disappearance. According to her statement, the driver looked like a middle-aged man, unremarkable, except perhaps for his gaze, too attentive and penetrating. The woman could not remember his face in detail, but was absolutely certain that she had never seen the car and the driver before. The police tried again to identify the owner or driver of the vehicle by checking surveillance camera recordings. In the year 2006, however, there were only few cameras, and the quality of the recordings did not allow clear recognition of the license plate or details of appearance. After weeks of careful but fruitless checking, this trail also ended definitively. The investigations returned once again to Ryan Stevenson, the teenage neighbor. He still had no alibi, and although no formal evidence existed against him, the police decided to examine Ryan's environment more closely. They questioned his friends and acquaintances, checked places he regularly visited. It turned out that the teenager had repeatedly been seen in the forest area at the edge of the city, exactly where the police had found Emily's traces. Ryan himself explained his excursion simply. He went there to walk alone and think. But his words were no longer believed so easily. Nevertheless, it soon turned out that the teenager had indeed been at this location often, long before Emily's disappearance. Residents and hunters confirmed that they had repeatedly seen him alone in the forest. And although this confirmed Ryan's words, the investigators did not rule out that he could have used the location he knew well for other purposes as well. At the same time, they also checked the teacher James Harris. His past aroused particular interest among the detectives. Harris had moved from Washington State to Oregon 3 years before Emily's disappearance. Before his move, he had worked as a teacher at an elementary school, from where he had been dismissed after complaints from parents about excessive attention towards students. Formally, he was not criminally prosecuted. Evidence of serious offenses was not found at that time, but the dismissal itself left an unpleasant aftertaste. Harris was thoroughly questioned again. He appeared extremely dismayed and repeated that he only wanted to help in the search for Emily. The investigators determined that the teacher behaved naturally during the conversation, answered confidently and coherently. The police additionally checked his alibi. It turned out that Harris had indeed participated in a school assembly on the day of Emily's disappearance, which dozens of witnesses confirmed. For the time being, it seemed as if the evidence against him would not come together into a clear picture. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the Parker family became particularly heavy. Emily's parents barely communicated with neighbors and the press anymore, withdrew into themselves and experienced their personal tragedy behind closed doors. They took every question from the investigators painfully, but continued to cooperate maximally with the detectives. Their older son, Daniel, a 14-year-old teenager, was also questioned. He reported nothing unusual, but the detectives noticed his nervousness and reticence, but considered this a natural state at his age and in this situation. Toward the end of the month, the police checked several more suspects from among the previously convicted residents of the district, but all these trails proved to be dead ends. The tension grew, and the investigators repeatedly hit a wall. No new facts or reliable clues appeared. At the beginning of June, the police officially announced that the active phase of the search was being discontinued. The Emily Parker case remained formally open, but without new evidence, the chances of solving the crime became increasingly smaller. The brief press conference by the police chief sounded dry and laconic. "We have done everything possible, but the investigations will continue until there are answers." It was exactly then that the city became seriously aware for the first time that Emily's disappearance might remain unsolved forever. No one could suspect that the investigations would only be resumed and find a continuation after almost 2 decades, when hardly anyone remembered this case anymore. After the active search phase had been officially ended, life in the city gradually returned to its usual patterns. Only for the Parker family, whose name in the city had now become synonymous with personal tragedy. Was there a clear separation between life before and after? But outwardly, for the surroundings, even they soon became part of the familiar landscape. Quiet, withdrawn, almost imperceptible amid the everyday hustle of the small town. Year after year passed. The Emily case was remembered less and less often, and soon the story completely transformed into a blind spot in the city's memory. Some residents moved away, including Ryan Stevenson, the teenager who had once been suspected of the disappearance, also moved away. The Parker family remained in the same place, perhaps in the hope that their questions would receive answers sooner or later. Periodically, the case was taken from the archives to give it new momentum, each time unsuccessfully. In the year 2011, Marcus Williams, a man with the reputation of a principled detective, was appointed as the new police chief. He studied the archives on the Emily case again, checked the versions with the unknown white delivery van and the mysterious call about the forest path once more. Under Williams' leadership, the investigators visited the forest area again, examined the abandoned house again, but nothing new could be discovered. Nevertheless, a new version emerged among the investigators. In the year 2012, it turned out, after an FBI inquiry, that at that time, a serial criminal was active in the region who specialized precisely in kidnappings. The local police carefully checked this trail. Representatives of the federal authorities came personally to the city, questioned witnesses, and took the old documents in hand again. For a while, it seemed as if the mystery of Emily's disappearance could find a logical explanation. But this version also quickly ran aground. Based on the methods, locations, and details of the crimes, it became clear that Emily's disappearance did not fit this man's pattern. The following years passed without visible changes. The case, as if cursed, did not allow getting even one step closer to the solution. James Harris, the teacher who had once participated more actively than others in the search, continued to teach at the local school and maintained the reputation of a somewhat strange but completely harmless man. Although the detectives periodically paid attention to him, there were still no formal grounds for suspicion. The Parker family had by this time definitively withdrawn into their own world. Emily's parents had hardly any contact with neighbors and limited communication to polite greetings or brief conversations about trivial topics. The older son, Daniel, left the city after school and began studies in another state. He practically never returned home anymore and tried to leave the past far behind. Meanwhile, a few more chiefs changed at the police, each of whom formally promised upon taking office not to forget the Emily case, but was factually confronted with the lack of new evidence and possibilities to move forward. The case gradually gathered dust in the archives and became one of dozens of similar unsolved cases in which questions remain unanswered forever. The year 2023 arrived. The city already lived with completely different worries and fears when at the end of summer something happened that made people talk again about the long-forgotten Emily Parker case. In August, a group of tourists who had come to the city for hiking discovered in the forest about 40 kilometers from the city an old, long-abandoned hunting lodge that had been unknown to the residents until then. The house was almost completely overgrown with undergrowth. The entrance was blocked by branches and bushes. The tourists were interested in the unusual building, decided to explore the area, and noticed, when they went a bit deeper into the forest behind the house, an area of ground that was distinguished by strange softness and looseness. Their discovery was immediately reported to the police. The law enforcement officers arriving at the location quickly recognized that the discovered ground area was not just a random soil anomaly. Soon the area was cordoned off. Forensic experts arrived. After the first working hours, human remains were found on the site that had been buried, not deep, hastily, and obviously long ago. The information spread quickly through the city and awakened the residents' memories once again. The Parker family was urgently called to the police and asked to provide DNA samples for an examination. A few days later, laboratory analyses confirmed what many had already suspected. The found remains belonged to Emily Parker, who had disappeared exactly 17 years earlier. Now the case took on a completely different, much harsher and clearer character. The disappearance became an officially recognized crime, whose investigations were resumed, and this time the police could not make any mistakes. At the same time, tension in the city began to rise. People feared admitting that the criminal who had done something so terrible could have lived quietly among them the entire time. The city filled again with conversations, suspicions, and secret fears that grew with each day and transformed the familiar environment into a completely different, frightening reality. The police officers understood very well that the new phase of investigations would be difficult and painful for everyone who had previously been involved in this case. The main question that now tormented the investigators was only one. How could it happen that the person who had committed this crime had remained unnoticed for so many years? And above all, who was she? This puzzle seemed to have become only more tangled, and its solution now required unprecedented caution and determination. After the identity of the found remains was confirmed, the investigations received new momentum. The Emily Parker case, which had been considered hopeless for years, unexpectedly gained a real perspective of being solved. The law enforcement authorities faced the extremely difficult task of reconstructing the chain of events that could lead to the person who had literally hidden in plain sight for years. The first step of the investigations was a renewed, but now more detailed examination of the abandoned hunting lodge and the surrounding terrain. Crime scene technicians spent several days conducting careful examinations and documenting the smallest details. The difficulty was that nature had almost completely hidden the traces over the past years. Grass, bushes, and trees had long since swallowed the few clues that could have shed light on the crime. Nevertheless, the crime scene technicians managed to make some important discoveries. First, clothing fragments were found that, according to expert opinion, clearly belonged to Emily. This made it possible to determine precisely that she had been brought to this place almost immediately after her disappearance. The analysis of the soil and clothing remains indicated that the perpetrator had acted quickly and nervously, without a prepared plan, but with the clear awareness of needing to obscure the traces. At the same time, the police began a comprehensive review of all persons who had been involved in the original investigations 17 years ago. The list of suspects steadily shrank. Ryan Stevenson, who had previously aroused suspicion, was far outside the state, led a completely normal life, and had reliable evidence of his innocence. Other persons who had come under suspicion had either long since left the region or could present convincing alibis. However, when the investigators took a closer look at teacher James Harris again, their interest increased considerably. Harris still lived in the neighboring town, taught at the local school, and enjoyed a good reputation. Outwardly, his life seemed impeccable, leisurely, quiet, and completely transparent. Nevertheless, the detectives decided to carefully examine his past and present life once more. Harris was summoned for a conversation under the pretext of renewed clarification of information about the old case. At the meeting, he seemed somewhat surprised, but maintained absolute calm and friendliness. For the investigators, it was difficult to even imagine that the sought person could be hiding behind such a balanced facade. One moment, however, caught the detectives' attention. The teacher could not plausibly explain some details of his move from his previous workplace. Hidden nervousness could be sensed in his answers, although outwardly he continued to appear confident and polite. After the meeting, the police requested additional information from Washington, where Harris had previously worked. Documents surfaced that had not previously come into focus of the local investigations. It turned out that Harris had come into the administration's sights at his former school several times due to complaints about overly close, even intrusive relationships with some students. At the time, this was not considered sufficiently serious for criminal prosecution. However, Harris left the school at the urging of the school administration. These details prompted the police to examine the teacher's lifestyle over the past 17 years more closely. In the course of covert observations, the detectives discovered that Harris regularly drove to the city outskirts and entered the forest area several times, exactly where Emily's remains had been found. It seemed strange that Harris showed interest in this place after so many years, but there was still no formal reason to accuse him. The investigators decided to conduct an authorized search of Harris's house, hoping to find something that could shed light on his involvement. Harris himself was present during the search, seemed unperturbed, and even offered help to the police officers to demonstrate his complete openness and willingness to cooperate. Although nothing suspicious was initially found in the house, the detectives noticed some old boxes in the garage that stood apart from the other things and obviously had not been opened for many years. Exactly in one of these boxes, the police officers discovered objects that left even experienced detectives speechless. Among long-forgotten trinkets, school documents, and children's drawings were objects that clearly belonged to Emily. Small things that Emily's parents had forgotten to mention due to the long time, but which now said much more than all words. Harris noticed the police officer's reaction, lost his composure for the first time, and could not give a plausible explanation for the find. After this event, the teacher was arrested and brought to the police station for interrogation. This time, his calm and self-confidence were gone. Harris was nervous, got tangled up in his statements, and categorically denied his involvement in the incident. He repeated that he did not understand how these objects could have gotten into his house and insisted that someone was setting a trap for him. For the police, however, The found objects became irrefutable evidence of Harris's involvement in the crime. But the investigators understood that this alone was not sufficient to bring a complete charge. It had to be found out exactly how these objects had gotten to Harris and what motive he could have had for committing such a serious crime. Meanwhile, the city, once again gripped by fear and unrest, could hardly comprehend that a man whom many knew as a respected and righteous citizen could be involved in such a cruel crime. People had difficulty with the thought that evil could have lived unnoticed beside them for so many years, hidden behind a mask of friendliness and trust. Exactly this thought gave no peace to all residents of the city, who were now forced to reconsider their attitude toward the past and toward everyone who had been part of their lives during these long 17 years. After James Harris's arrest, the investigators faced difficult and laborious work. Despite the found objects that belonged to Emily, Harris continued to insist on his complete innocence. He demanded a lawyer, refused further statements, and completely withdrew into himself. The police understood that it was difficult to base a charge solely on the fact of finding the objects. Convincing evidence had to be found that connected Harris to the crime scene and completely excluded the possibility of these objects appearing by chance in his house. The investigators began a detailed examination of Harris's life over the last 17 years. His emails, bank accounts, telephone calls, and even his driving routes were checked with particular care. The detailed examination of Harris's phone revealed several peculiarities. In recent years, he had repeatedly switched off his mobile phone when driving into forest areas. Based on records from surveillance cameras at gas stations and shops, it could be confirmed that his car regularly appeared near exactly that forest. Meanwhile, the city residents who had learned of Harris' arrest expressed incredulous horror. Many students and parents stepped forward to defend him, claiming that the accusation against the teacher appeared absurd. But as often happens in such cases, gradually other, less pleasant details came to light. Several former students of Harris informed the police that he had shown excessive interest and exaggerated attention toward them, which had seemed strange and disturbing to them even then, but was not taken seriously by the adults. Particularly great attention from the investigators was drawn to a concrete incident that had occurred 1 year before Emily's disappearance. A female student told that Harris had once offered to drive her home after class. At first, this seemed harmless and natural, but then she noticed that the teacher repeated his offers, although she declined them each time. Finally, her parents even approached the school administration, but the incident was quickly swept under the carpet, dismissed as simple care by the teacher, and no great significance was attached to it. The police checked again the statements of all who might have seen Harris on the day of Emily's disappearance. Although Harris's alibi had previously been confirmed by witnesses of the school assembly, new circumstances emerged. One of the witnesses who had confirmed many years ago that Harris had been at the school all day unexpectedly changed her statement. Now the woman admitted that she actually could not remember exactly whether someone had seen Harris directly during the assembly or whether he had joined the group later. She conceded that she might have been mistaken at the time or simply joined the general opinion that the teacher was present. This unexpected information prompted the investigators to conduct renewed questioning of other witnesses from that day. The result was disturbing. None of those questioned could now firmly confirm having seen Harris at the assembly throughout the day. The real possibility arose that the teacher could have left the school unnoticed by using the general attention on the event and returned in such a way that his absence attracted no one's attention. Against this background, the statements of another witness, an elderly city resident named Joseph Walsh, became particularly important. The man, who lived not far from the place of Emily's disappearance, told the police that on that day he saw a car similar to Harris's standing on a quiet street not far from the bus stop. Walsh noticed the car only from the corner of his eye, which is why he attached no significance to it at the time. However, when he now remembered those events, he was absolutely certain that it was the teacher's car. The police turned again to forensic technicians and experts in digital technology. Harris' car was thoroughly examined. Although years had passed, the investigators hoped to find any traces that pointed to involvement. And although no clear evidence was found, the forensic technicians confirmed that the trunk of the car had been subjected to chemical cleaning. This fact disturbed the investigators even more. Harris himself explained that he had merely once spilled chemicals that he had bought for work on the house, and thoroughly cleaned the trunk to avoid damage to the car. But this explanation already seemed unconvincing. Soon the police found another reason to doubt Harris' honesty. It turned out that for many years he had actively followed the development of the investigations by carefully collecting newspaper clippings, recordings of television reports, and internet materials about the Emily case. He claimed this had been a kind of expression of his personal concern and sympathy for the family. But the investigators evaluated this detail as evidence that Harris was trying to control the information about the case and stay informed about all details of the investigations. The investigations concluded that James Harris possessed not only the possibility, but also a motive, about which he categorically refused to speak. But a mere theory was not sufficient to bring a formal charge. More convincing evidence was needed that would directly connect Harris with the crime. But even in this phase, it became clear to the entire city that the man they knew so well and had trusted for years might not have been who he seemed to be. The atmosphere in the city intensified to the extreme, and the residents began asking themselves disturbing questions. Was Harris really the one who had committed this cruel crime? Or was the police mistaken again in attempting to find a culprit in such a long and tangled case? Now the answer to this question would determine not only the punishment of the guilty party, but also the ability of the city residents to regain trust in the people who lived beside them. The investigations were approaching their climax, and it was clear to everyone that the secret that had tormented the city for almost 2 decades could be definitively solved in the near future. The investigations, revived by new evidence, forced the investigators to delve deeply into James Harris's life long before the events in Oregon. They carefully checked his entire biography, hoping to find something that could explain the reasons and circumstances for committing this crime. Particular attention was drawn to the phase of Harris's life about which very little was known, the period after his discharge in Washington state and before his appearance in Oregon. In official documents, this time period was illuminated very superficially and revealed almost no details about what exactly Harris was occupied with during this time. The investigators established that Harris spent about half a year in a small town in Idaho after his discharge. He did not work at the local school but lived very withdrawn and lonely. His neighbors remembered the man as a quiet, almost inconspicuous person who rarely spoke with anyone and practically never left the house. At that time, this behavior aroused no suspicion and therefore also did not attract the attention of law enforcement agencies. But now, the police were particularly interested in this period. The investigators traveled to Idaho and questioned the residents of the area where Harris had once lived. One of the former neighbors told that he often drove somewhere with his car late at night. The man noticed this because he lived nearby and worked night shifts. He remembered how he once met Harris around midnight in a forest area not far from the city. To his question about what the teacher was doing there, Harris calmly answered that he simply could not sleep and came here to think alone. At that time, this explanation seemed completely harmless, and the neighbor attached no significance to it. Taking into account the circumstances and timing of the crime in Oregon, however, the investigators decided to check the forest area in Idaho mentioned by the witness. There, it was practically impossible to find physical evidence after so many years, but the fact of Harris's nighttime drives to remote places seemed disturbing and could point to a behavioral pattern typical for a potential criminal. Back in Oregon, the detectives questioned Harris again and confronted him with new details and questions about his life in Idaho. This time, his behavior during questioning was completely different. Harris remained silent, only occasionally repeating the sentence that he did not understand what this had to do with Emily's disappearance. His lawyer actively prevented the recording of new statements and insisted that all information regarding Idaho was not directly connected with this case. In parallel, the police officers decided to check Harris's banking transactions and credit cards for the entire relevant time period. It turned out that Harris had made several purchases in hardware stores and household goods shops shortly before and immediately after Emily's disappearance. Among other things, the shopping lists included plastic tarps, adhesive tape, and chemical cleaning agents for surfaces. These items were nothing special in themselves, but their acquisition at the right time became another disturbing signal. Furthermore, police technical specialists recovered deleted data from one of Harris's old computers that had been confiscated during the search. On the hard drive, previously deleted search queries were found that the teacher had already made in search engines in the year 2006. Harris searched for information about methods for covering tracks and effective ways to clean various surfaces of biological traces. These facts significantly strengthened the police's suspicion of his involvement in the crime. At the same time, the Parker family, who had already lost hope of learning the truth, followed the investigation and could barely cope with their emotions. With each new fact, it became increasingly difficult for them to endure the tension that had built up over the years. The city residents again expressed their sympathy to the family, but this sympathy was already different, more cautious, mixed with embarrassment and uncertainty about the fact that the true culprit had been so close all this time. Despite the growing number of evidence, the investigators still lacked the most important thing: clear and unambiguous proof that could directly connect Harris to the place where Emily had been found. The crime had occurred too long ago, which significantly complicated the investigators' task. Yet, an unexpected breakthrough in the case did occur. One of the tourists who had found the remains shared another important detail with the police that had initially gone unnoticed. The man told that, when examining the area near the abandoned house, he had noticed an old hunting knife that was almost completely covered by earth and moss. The tourist did not attach special significance to the find, and only remembered it now when reviewing the photos from the site where the remains were found. The police immediately returned to the crime scene, where after detailed examination the mentioned object was found. The investigation revealed that the knife had lain in the ground for about as many years as had passed since Emily's disappearance. Most importantly was the discovery of DNA traces of two people on the knife, from Emily herself and an unknown man. Comparing this DNA sample with the samples taken from James Harris could finally clarify all points in this long-standing case. However, Harris categorically refused to voluntarily provide his biological material for examination, which forced the police to request a corresponding court order. The judge, considering the significance of the evidence, granted permission for the forced collection of a DNA sample. Now the investigators had to wait for the results that could finally confirm or refute James Harris's involvement in the crime. Awaiting the results, the city again froze in tense expectation. The residents understood that now not only Harris's fate was being decided, but also the possibility of finally closing this dark chapter in the city's life. No one could feel completely safe anymore, knowing that a person capable of such a crime could live among them for so long. The results of the DNA expertise were obtained after 3 weeks. These weeks were infinitely long for the city. The atmosphere was heavy, the residents seemed frozen, waiting for the final answer to the question that had tormented everyone for almost 2 decades. When the detectives received the official report, there were no more doubts. The traces found on the knife matched James Harris's DNA sample. On the same day, Harris was officially charged. Realizing that the situation was irreversible, he decided to speak for the first time, and his lawyer arranged the conditions for a detailed confession. Harris understood that this was the only chance to escape the maximum sentence by providing all necessary information that could at least partially explain his actions. During a closed interrogation, in the presence of his lawyer and the prosecutor, James Harris, calmly and in detail, told everything that had happened on that day in April 2006. He confessed that he had noticed Emily for a long time when she was still several years younger. According to his words, he initially planned no crimes and assured that he had merely felt interest. Over time, however, This developed into an obsession from which he could no longer free himself. On that day, Harris waited for the right moment and left the school unnoticed, using the general bustle and attention focused on the ongoing event. He knew that Emily always walked home alone and deliberately chose a street section where normally no one was present at that time of day. He offered to drive her home, and Emily, trusting her teacher, agreed. Harris claimed he had not originally intended to harm her, but when Emily panicked and asked to be let out of the car, he became afraid of the consequences if she told someone about it. In panic, Harris drove her to a remote forest area, hoping to somehow control the situation, but the events got out of control too quickly. Emily tried to run away, screamed, and he, having finally lost self-control, committed the irreversible. Harris further told the investigators that immediately after the act, he had buried all evidence near the abandoned hut, hoping that this place would never be found. He carefully concealed any connection to that day and, after returning to school, joined the assembly as if nothing had happened. Subsequently, Harris constantly followed the investigation, actively participated in it, and helped the volunteers in order to completely deflect suspicion from himself. To the investigators' question about why he had kept Emily's personal belongings at his home, Harris answered that he himself could not fully understand why he had done that. Perhaps it was his own attempt to maintain the illusion of control over a situation that had actually long since slipped away from him. These objects had been stored at his place for years, like a hidden memory of what he had once done, frightening and fascinating him at the same time. The trial against Harris became the most discussed event in the city's history. The residents, shaken by the confession of the man they had known for so long, could not believe that this had really happened. The Parker family felt relief for the first time in many years that the truth had finally come to light, although the realization that the man who had taken their dearest from them had lived next door for so many years hurt them deeply once again. During the court proceedings, Harris showed no emotions, appeared calm and distant, and repeated his story without unnecessary details. He knew that the verdict was already decided. The prosecution presented irrefutable evidence of his guilt, and no arguments from the defense could change the course of the trial anymore. The last day of the trial was Emily's mother's appearance, who, struggling to hold back her emotions, told Harris that she could never forgive him. She demanded no revenge but asked for only one thing: a just punishment so that he could never again cause pain to others. After her speech, complete silence reigned in the courtroom. No one dared even to move. The verdict was clear. James Harris was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of early release. He listened to the verdict as indifferently as everything else and left the courtroom under the complete silence of those present. After the conclusion of the court proceedings, the city could not recover from the shock for a long time. People asked themselves questions to which there were no simple answers. How could the criminal remain unnoticed for so many years? Could they have noticed him earlier and prevented what happened? Gradually, the city returned to its usual rhythm of life, but the memory of what had happened remained forever. The Parker family decided to move to another state, hoping to begin a new life in which there would be less pain and memories of the past. The city's residents, although they continued to live, could never completely free themselves from the feeling of fear and distrust that this terrible crime had left them. The Emily Parker case was finally closed. However, it left a deep trace in the memory of everyone who was connected to it in one way or another. And even now, years later, it is repeatedly remembered as a reminder that true evil can hide for years in the most ordinary and familiar face.